And we are live. Good evening, LBE community. I am excited to be joining you here tonight with another Live Black Experience conversation. It is my honor to be joined this evening by Dr. Michael Green, who's going to be speaking with us tonight about President Lincoln's party. We've had a lot of conversations already coming into this year that have taken us through some of the history of our nation and made reference to Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation and some of the history of the establishment of our party system, and just noted a kind of preliminary note on the shift in those parties from the time of Lincoln and beyond. So, what was traditionally considered Democrat has shifted. What was traditionally considered Republican has shifted, and tonight, I think we're going to dive a little bit more into Lincoln's views and perspectives and how that reflected some of or predated some of the shifts that we've seen in our modern time. By way of introduction, I'm happy to introduce you all to a frequent collaborator with us on these sessions, Dr. Michael Green. He is an associate professor of history in UNLV's Department of History. He earned his BA and MA at UNLV and his PhD at Columbia University. And he teaches courses on 19th century America and on Nevada and Las Vegas for the History Department and the Honors College. He has books on the Civil War era, including Freedom, Union, and Power, Lincoln and his Party During the Civil War, Politics in America in Crisis, The Coming of the Civil War, Lincoln and the Election of 1860, and most recently, Lincoln and Native Americans in 2021. He has published several books on Nevada, including his college-level textbook, Nevada, A History of the Silver State in 2015. Welcome, Dr. Green.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us. I know that many of you who are watching are on the ancestral lands of the Hopi and other indigenous groups of Arizona, and I come to you from the land of the Nuwu or Southern Paiute and their ancestors, and I wanted to begin with that. I wanted to talk a bit about how we're going to do this. If I am correct, I can see your comments as you post them. And if you have questions as I go along, please feel free to go ahead, or comments, whatever, post, and we will figure it all out. Also, I have to tell you that I told my best friend in the history department today that I'd be talking tonight on Lincoln and politics, and he said, "How many hours are they giving you?" And I was reminded of a story about Henry Kissinger, who a reporter asked, "In 30 seconds, could you?" And before the reporter could finish, Kissinger said, "I have not placed my verb in 30 seconds." So I may go for a while. But at any rate, it's great to be here and to talk about Lincoln and politics and political principles. Let's start with the fact that Abraham Lincoln was a political animal, a politician to his toenails. And I'll give you an example of this. He moves away from home in 1831. He arrives in New Salem. In 1832, he runs for the legislature and loses. And it is the only election he ever lost on a direct vote by the people. He was very proud of that. He then was elected to the state legislature in 34, 36, 38, and 40. In 42, he mapped out how to get elected to the House of Representatives and campaigned in 42 and 44, got elected in 46, campaigning for that. In 48, he didn't run, but he campaigned for the presidential candidate. And he campaigned for legislators in 50 and 52, 54. He ran for the legislature. The next year, he ran for the Senate. In 58, he runs for the Senate. In between, he's mentioned for vice president very seriously at the first Republican convention. Then in 1860, he runs. And in 64, he runs. 62, he's plotting congressional elections. He was very much into politics. And it's worth remembering that today we often look at politics and say, crooked or boring or whatever. Back then, it was a major social thing. If you think of parties like fraternity or sorority parties or something like that, they didn't have that then. What you did was you got together and you worked in politics and you met people and you found people with similar interests and made friendships that way. Lincoln, in fact, was attracted to Mary Todd in part because she was interested in politics. So politics was a more important part of people's lives at that time. Another factor we need to take into account, and this is sort of the less attractive side, we are in the 21st century, but we are talking about a person and people around him of the 19th century. And their words and views are going to be different. You can say Lincoln was very advanced in some ways and not in others. A way to look at this is that a wonderful Civil War historian named James McPherson was once interviewed about Lincoln on a talk show. And the talk show host said, "What would Lincoln think of busing? Or what would he say about busing?" And he said, Lincoln would say, "What's a bus?" So when we talk about things like race and racism, these are concepts that were a bit foreign to Abraham Lincoln and the people of his time. They would not have used the same language. So, with all that in mind, Lincoln began his political life, as he described himself, as always a Whig in politics. Now, the Democratic Party was the older party, and Andrew Jackson was what you might call the titular leader or the public face of the party. And really, the top Whig was Henry Clay, a Kentuckian whom Lincoln called his beau ideal of a statesman. And Lincoln completely supported the Whig platform. And the Whigs really concentrated on economic development, the idea being that the United States would expand economically, and that was more important than, say, land expansion, although they were willing to accept that as well. Now, you might ask, where does slavery enter into that discussion? If you were going to talk about the two parties, you would say that you were more likely to find people who raised questions about slavery in the Whig Party. And it was not that you would call them advanced on racial issues, as certainly not so advanced as we would like, but more along the lines that they thought of slavery as an impediment to the development of the economy as they saw it, to industrialization, to the building of railroads and canals and that sort of thing. And they wanted tariffs to encourage industry, and enslavers generally did not want that. Tariffs would mean they'd have to pay more for the products they were buying. Lincoln was anti slavery. There should not really be an argument about that. And you can go back to 1837 when the editor Elijah Lovejoy was killed by a mob in southern Illinois, and the state legislature had a resolution criticizing abolitionists for causing violence. In their opinion, if Lovejoy had not been printing abolitionist editorials, he would have been fine. Lincoln refused to sign it and issued a dissent saying that he didn't think that abolitionists alone were to blame. He blamed the people who killed Lovejoy. But at the same time, he tended to think that both sides got too emotional about things. Now, I'm paraphrasing him, but Lincoln was part of an era called the Age of Reform. And it's linked to the Second Great Awakening, this movement of religious revivalism. There's utopian socialism, where people are forming communities of their own. And there is this attitude that we can change the world. And out of this age of reform, you get the rise of the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, temperance, people opposed to alcohol. You also get dietary reform. This is one of my favorites. There was a doctor who said that if you ate this piece of flat, unleavened bread, it would be good for you. It would give you fiber. And I always like to tell people nobody believed this until Dr. Sylvester Graham put chocolate on his graham crackers. I mean, people are talking about all kinds of changes. Lincoln's a reformer. He wants change, but he does not belong to reform groups. And he even tells reformers, it is not wise to attack other people you're going to drive them away from you. And we have a two-party system, at that time, Democrats and Whigs. And if your reform leads you not to vote for one of the two parties, you're throwing away your vote. You could accomplish more being in a political party and trying to get that party to do what you want it to do. And Lincoln took that approach in Congress when he served his one term. He was part of an effort to eliminate enslavement in the District of Columbia, which, as a federal enclave, was the one place that Lincoln and others agreed the federal government had the right and power to do this under the Constitution. It didn't go anywhere. The effort failed. But the fact is that Lincoln did attempt this. Well, when he left Congress, he was, it appeared, pretty much finished politically. The only Whig congressional district in Illinois was the one he served in. It was a mostly Democratic state. Senator Stephen A. Douglas was clearly the most powerful Democrat in Illinois, one of the most powerful politicians in the country. And Lincoln, it appeared, was just going to go back home, practice law, build a family. And even that for him was a remarkable achievement when you consider him coming from a poor log cabin with very little education. Then in 1854, the second party system, as it was called, began to come completely apart. And Douglas, his frenemy, actually more enemy than friend, had a lot to do with this. Douglas, representing Illinois, wanted to see the construction of a transcontinental railroad, and he wanted it to be built from Chicago, city in his state. Southerners who talked about building a railroad said, fine, but build it from New Orleans. Now, the fact is, building a southern railroad to Southern California made no sense in the 1850s. The gold rush was in Northern California. That's where the action was. But Douglas needed their votes. And they finally said to him, if you will repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which limited the spread of slavery, just to give us a chance for slavery to expand, we will support you. And Douglas's response was, I'll do it, but it'll create a hell of a storm. He was right. He once said that he could travel back from Washington, D.C. to Illinois by the light of the effigies in which he was being burned. Well, when he pushed this bill through, the Democratic Party made it a party vote. You're a loyal Democrat, you vote for it. And a lot of Northern Democrats differed from Douglas. Douglas believed in popular sovereignty, which I like to refer to as the American democratic ideal taken to its illogical conclusion, which was he and other white people could vote on whether they had the right to enslave black people. Lincoln opposed this all along. So did a lot of Northern Democrats, and so did a lot of Northern Whigs. Southern Democrats and Whigs just said, let slavery go wherever we want. Well, Douglas got his bill passed. The railroad was not built yet. And a lot of Northern Democrats left the party, and Democrats took a bath in the 1854 election. But the people who did win were not Whigs, but anti-slavery Northerners. And the Whig Party was already very creaky. There were a lot of divisions within it. It finally came apart, and at a town in Wisconsin called Ripon, they had the first true meeting in 1854 of people who called themselves the Republican Party. And Lincoln would migrate over the next year and help organize the Republican Party in Illinois. So as of around 1855, we still have the Democratic Party. The Whigs are on the way out, if they aren't gone already. And we now have this anti-slavery Northern Republican Party. There's another party being created at the time. It will be prominent for a year or two and then sort of peter out. And it was a group of mostly old Whigs who didn't care about enslavement, as well as people who felt strongly about the issue of immigration. I know you're shocked that immigration was an issue. I mean, immigration's never an issue, right? And even in the 1850s, they were fighting about this. In this case, mostly about Irish Catholic immigrants who had recently migrated because of the potato blight. And they form a party called the American Party. And some of the people who go into it are the old Whigs. And once that party dies out in the late 1850s, you find more of the old Whigs beginning to say, all right, in the North, we'll go to the Republican Party. And in the South, we're just going to do our own thing. Well, the Republican Party is a going concern, if you will, in 1855. Lincoln actually runs for the U.S. Senate. And remember that back then, the Senate was elected by state legislatures. It was not a direct vote. And at the state legislature, Lincoln could not get a majority because he was seen still as too much of an old Whig. And Democrats there wouldn't vote for him, including Democrats who were anti slavery and moving toward the Republican Party. And instead, they elected an old acquaintance of Lincoln's named Lyman Trumbull. But it was pretty clear Lincoln now was more active politically. And he began in 1854, in fact, doing a lot of speeches talking about slavery as wrong, a moral wrong. He also was clear that he did not believe the United States government had the power to abolish slavery because the institution, he believed, was protected under the Constitution. He felt the Constitution was not pro-slavery, and he set out to prove this. The point was that under the powers of the federal government in the Constitution, he did not feel that the federal government could say to states where slavery existed, you must get rid of it. His goal was to stop it from spreading. And that was the goal of the Republican Party when it was created. No more slavery in territories, in newly acquired lands if the U.S. expanded beyond its borders. Now, there's a lot of debate among historians, and trust me on this, you get two historians in a room, you will have a minimum of 5 opinions on an issue. I'm a historian. I've been in rooms with them. But one of the arguments you can make here is that Republicans may not have said they were trying to end slavery, but it's pretty clear they were. And the analogy I like to use when I'm teaching is this. Suppose you have a plant in a pot. You've got a potted plant, and the roots are growing, and there isn't room left for them to grow. What do? Well, you repot the plant. What if you don't? The plant will be choked to death. And Southerners believed, even if Republicans weren't always convinced of this themselves, that if they could not expand slavery, it would die. Not that Lincoln would have minded. But this also brings us to the question Republicans faced at the time. There were approximately 4 million African Americans who were enslaved. What would happen if they were free? Henry Clay had been very active in founding and running what was called the American Colonization Society. Lincoln believed this was worth trying, and so did a lot of other Republicans. He was hardly alone. And the idea was that freed people would then be encouraged to go to Africa or some other place. Based on Lincoln's belief that even if African Americans were entitled to equal treatment under the law, and he mostly believed they were, mostly, not entirely, that we would never have peace, that the country would not tolerate this, even if he would personally. He did, in fact, try a colonization project during the Civil War. It didn't work. And once the Emancipation Proclamation came out, he never mentioned it again. That was the end of it as far as he was concerned. But this is often discussed when we talk about Lincoln, and I did feel it was important to mention it. Now, the question of citizenship that has popped up in the comments, so did Lincoln believe that African Americans were citizens of the United States? The answer is yes. And this will unfold as we go, but in 1857, the United States Supreme Court ruled, in the case of Dred Scott v. Sanford, that slavery could exist anywhere, basically. That African Americans had, as Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote in one of the worst statements ever written by just about anybody you can imagine, that the black man had no rights that the white man was bound to respect. Lincoln completely disagreed. He pointed out that African Americans had had assorted rights from the moment the Constitution was written. He would argue that the founding fathers believed this, and that African Americans had various rights as citizens. He did not expect, to answer another question that has come up, all African Americans to go back to Africa. We don't want to paint him as entirely a white supremacist, even if he made statements that today we look at and we just shudder. Some of them were mainly for political reasons. Some of them he may have truly believed. But there is a line in a William Faulkner story where there's a character who is, in his own mind at least, free of racial animus or real bias. And he's saying maybe in 100 years, maybe in 1,000 years, but not now. And the point of it is he cannot see the reality. For a while, Lincoln didn't see the reality. And one of the things that's important to realize about Lincoln, and a lot of other Republicans, but especially Lincoln at the time, is that they were capable of changing, of improving. Now, there's a tendency among some people to say we think Lincoln started perfect and got better. No. But as we're going to see as this unfolds, Lincoln does move in what I think we would agree is the right direction. The Republican Party moves more in the right direction. And Lincoln tries to propel the Republican Party in that direction by running for the U.S. Senate in 1858 against Stephen Douglas. And these have become sort of the great folkloric standard of debates. I want you to imagine the comparison if you watched debates between candidates in the recent election, or if you watched Joe Biden and Donald Trump debate. When Lincoln and Douglas debated, one of them would speak for an hour. The other would then get 90 minutes, and then the first speaker would get 30 minutes for rebuttal. If you can imagine 3 hours, no moderator, it's just them. Well, that's the difference with politics. Back then, you expected a show, and those two guys gave it to you. Now, in the process, Lincoln is trying to corner Douglas on certain issues to show that he, in fact, is not really as good a Democrat as he claims. Douglas is engaging in outright racial demagoguery. He is claiming that Lincoln believes in racial intermarriage. He is claiming that Lincoln and other Republicans want absolute equality for African Americans. And Lincoln, to his eternal discredit, denies it. And he denies it mainly because he wants to win the election. And one of his comments in the debate is, just because I believe that a black woman should be free doesn't mean I want or need to take her for a wife. That is your choice. Well, he loses. Douglas is reelected. And Lincoln says, I'm glad I made the race. I forced Douglas to take some bad positions. I took the stand that slavery is immoral. And he made that clear. He took the stand that the United States should be free of slavery, or at the very least should not allow it to spread. And after this, there are Republicans who begin to promote him as a possible presidential candidate. Now, in 1860, when Republicans were going to have their campaign for president, first they got a little lucky. The Democratic Party divided. Now, many of you have heard the old Will Rogers joke, I don't belong to an organized political party, I'm a Democrat. Well, Democrats can be divided at times. And in this case, they split into northern and southern wings. The Southern Democrats believed in the Dred Scott decision, believed that the federal government should make every effort to expand slavery. The Northern Democrats said, no, put it to a vote. If people want it, they can have it. If they don't want it, they don't have to have it. In turn, the old Whigs who didn't really have a home formed their own little party called the Constitutional Union Party. Their position was the Union as it is and the Constitution as it is, and let's not discuss slavery at all, and we can just avoid the issue. I was pointing out today to one of my classes that the abbreviation for Constitutional Union Party is CU, and that's pretty much what happened with that election. CU, there, they were gone. Well, the Republican Party is trying to figure out who to nominate for president. In 1856, their nominee was John C. Fremont, who in fact was governor of Arizona Territory later, and before this campaign had actually visited my town of Las Vegas. He literally put Las Vegas on the map as a federal cartographer or leader of a map-making expedition. Fremont was ardently anti-slavery. And when he lost, Republicans noticed how close the election actually was. They did very well for the first time a party was running a presidential campaign. And they thought, if we can get a more moderate candidate who can win the swing states, we can win the presidency. Does this sound familiar? I bet it does. We're having these debates today. Well, in 1860, the Republican frontrunner was a senator from New York State named William Henry Seward, who a lot of people saw as a very radical Republican. Today we'd say a very liberal Republican, who had said there's a higher law than the Constitution to explain why slavery should not expand. And he was widely seen as strongly anti-slavery. He also was widely seen as corrupt. And there's no nice way to put it. He had a political machine in New York. He didn't run it. He had his own partner in crime, if you want to call him that, a guy named Thurlow Weed. And Weed was pretty well known for going to the state legislature in Albany and bribing people and doing what he needed to do to get what he wanted. And Seward's associated with that. And Republicans have a problem with this because the incumbent president, who's not running for re-election, James Buchanan, had run a very corrupt administration, and they want to be able to attack Buchanan on corruption. They can't do that with Seward. They're also fearful that Seward's perceived radicalism would cost them votes. They also realized Seward really was less radical than he seemed, and therefore Republicans might not get enthusiastic. So he was kind of the perfect bad candidate. Then who? Well, there were some influential Republicans led by Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, who wanted a guy from Missouri named Edward Bates, an old Whig, nominally anti-slavery, basically on the grounds that he had no record to attack. He had spent very little time in politics. But Bates didn't excite most Republicans. There was Salmon Chase, a Republican from Ohio, very radical, truly radical. Unfortunately, he had the tendency to cut deals with other politicians to get what he wanted and stepped on a few toes in the process, not uncommon in politics. But the problem in that case was if Seward's too radical, Chase is really too radical. So what do we do? Well, when we talk about Lincoln and his party and Lincoln as a politician, the Republican Party decided to hold its nominating convention in 1860 in Chicago, Illinois, Lincoln State. The head of the Republican Party in Illinois got control of the convention floor. And if you ever watch a presidential convention, you'll notice that, for example, in 2020, the Delaware and California delegations at the Democratic convention were down front because that's where Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are from. Well, they do position people on the floor. And what they did was put the Illinois delegation in the middle with the other delegations that were undecided and stuck the New Yorkers who were for Seward in a corner where they couldn't get to anybody. Politics can be a great, fun game for great stakes. And in this case, Lincoln did okay on the first ballot. He had a few votes. And for the second ballot, his supporters in Chicago realized they needed some help. They needed more votes. And they met with a delegation from Pennsylvania, which is called the Keystone State, and it was a key state in politics, as it still is. They promised Pennsylvania a cabinet position if Lincoln won, which, by the way, they were going to get anyway. And after this meeting, one of Lincoln's managers was walking out with another of them and turned and said, Lincoln said, "Make no ties that bind me." And the other guy replied, "Lincoln ain't here." Well, they made ties that bound him. And on the next ballot, he won the nomination. And with a divided Democratic Party, he and the Republicans swept into the White House. Now, here's where the fun begins. Some of this is not fun, obviously. We know that Southern states seceded. We tend to forget that when the states claim to have left the Union, their congressional representatives left Congress. Suddenly, Republicans, who had been in a minority in Congress, had a majority. And when Lincoln took office, Republicans controlled the House and Senate, which they would not have done if the South had not seceded. Now, as we know, Lincoln takes office March 4th, 1861. He tries to reassure the South that he's not going to go after them. And eventually, the South fires the first shot at Fort Sumter, and the Civil War begins. Lincoln and Republicans then face a bit of a dilemma. They want as much support for the war as they can get. Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's old rival from Illinois, goes to the White House, tells Lincoln, "Look, you and I don't have to agree on slavery for me to tell you I am for the Union. I will support everything you do to preserve the Union." Sadly, Douglas died not long after that. And it may be that it hurt the Union war effort because he might have been able to unite Northern Democrats in a way that Lincoln could not as an opponent. But during the war, the Republican Party technically ceased to exist. They changed their name to the Union Party. And they did this in the hope that Democrats who supported the Union but didn't necessarily agree with Republicans on what to do about slavery would come to the party, would join them. And in fact, they succeeded. They got a good number of what were called war Democrats to vote for the Union Party. Well, what is the Republican Party or the Union Party? And I'm going to use it interchangeably here. What are they going to do during the Civil War? What are they going to do about the institution of slavery? Well, it's a difficult question. To us today, the moral question, as it was to Lincoln, is clear. It's wrong. But an example of the problems that existed both within the party and throughout the country comes to us from the state of Missouri, which had enslaved people. And Lincoln sent John Fremont there to be in command of the Union Army's forces. And Fremont was having some trouble. There was some corruption around him. He was in a political fight. And he issued his own Emancipation Proclamation in the late summer of 1861. And Lincoln asked him nicely to rescind it. And Fremont wouldn't. So Lincoln did it for him and got a lot of criticism from what we would call radical Republicans, the strongly anti-slavery Republicans. And Lincoln said, allegedly, "I want God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." And what he meant was that there were border states where slavery existed that had gone with the Union. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri in particular. And Kentucky, well, Delaware was a very small state. Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland are very important. And Lincoln's fear, which I think is justified, is that if he moves too quickly against slavery, or even moves against slavery, those states will switch. And just to give an idea, bear in mind that Washington, D.C. is between Virginia and Maryland. And Lincoln would have been completely surrounded by rebel states. Lincoln also objected to Fremont issuing this, and I throw this in because we should think about it. He objected because he said Fremont is a general. He is in the Army. These are decisions for the civil or civilian government, not for generals to make. Well, there is action against enslavement. There was a pro-slavery Democrat named Benjamin Butler from Massachusetts, who, when the South seceded, switched. He switched to the Union side. He switched to the Republican side. He said, this is wrong. Slavery is the cause of it. I'm against slavery. And he becomes a general. Lincoln appointed politicians to be generals, trying to build support for the Union cause. Now, this is where we get into the question of Lincoln as the great emancipator, because there is also something called the self-emancipation thesis. And it goes something like this. When the Civil War began, enslaved people understood that this was eventually going to lead to the end of slavery and took action accordingly. They left. They left plantations, they left where they were enslaved, and they headed for Union Army camps. Now, this part is true. What we tend to forget is that it was still entirely possible, as crazy as it may sound to us, that Lincoln could have said, no, send them back and take them back. He didn't. He wouldn't have. But there is this problem. We have people pouring into army camps. This is a new army. They're just trying to get things together. And here are people arriving. And Ben Butler came up with the idea that under the laws of war, you could seize your enemy's property. If there was a battle and they left guns or shovels, today they might leave tanks or missiles, whatever, and if they left them, you can take them. And his theory was, you know what? You guys claim you have the right to enslave people. You claim their property. Fine. We're taking them. Well, this is very controversial. And ultimately, Congress passes a couple of laws related to the act of confiscation, whether you could take Southerners' property. And that property under this definitely meant enslaved people. And Lincoln is going along, signing legislation and so on. He also is pondering what to do about slavery. And in the summer of 1862, he talked with a couple of his cabinet members. In fact, two people who he suspected would oppose his proclamation: Seward, his Secretary of State, and the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. And he said, I'm thinking of issuing an emancipation proclamation saying that slavery is over in the southern states because they're rebelling against the United States. Later, he has a cabinet meeting. He brings it up, and they kind of debated a bit. And Seward finally said, look, I support emancipation, but we haven't won any battles. And nobody's going to care if you issue this. Wait for a victory, then issue it. Well, Lincoln does issue it after the Union barely wins at Antietam on September 17, 1862. 5 days later, he issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It's exactly 100 days to New Year's Day, and he says that if Southern states do not stop this, all enslaved people in their borders are free. Now, a few things related to this. One is there are people who say that the proclamation didn't free anybody. It actually did. It freed people who already were in lands controlled by the U.S., where they had defeated Southerners. In addition, as the Union Army progressed, slavery would end where they were victorious. And they now had an executive order from the commander-in-chief saying that. Now, was it popular? In 1862, there were congressional elections, and Lincoln's Union Party, 6 weeks after he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, lost seats. The Illinois and Indiana legislatures went Democratic and defeated Republican incumbents in the Senate and remove them and put in Democrats who fought Lincoln. There were people who thought, as a result of this, Lincoln would back off. Well, one of the most vocal radical Republicans was a senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner, who's often most remembered as the senator who was attacked by a Southerner with a cane in 1856 and nearly killed. Sumner was very anti-slavery. He knew Lincoln was anti-slavery. He knew that the Democratic Party, to address a question in the comments, didn't have any desire to get rid of slavery. If it went away, but they're not going to lead any effort to get rid of it. And at one point, Sumner said this, and other people would ask Lincoln this, and Lincoln came up with a soundbite. They would ask him, are you going to rescind the proclamation? They asked him before it took effect. They asked him after it took effect. And Lincoln's response was, I would not if I could, and I could not if I would. Well, he would not if he could because he believed in emancipation. Yes, as a war measure mainly, but as a step against slavery. And he could not, he believed, because he had made this promise. They were now recruiting African American soldiers. They were trying to set up the southern states that were now coming back into the Union, Louisiana and Tennessee at the time. The Confederacy had been pretty well defeated there, and they're trying to set them up without slavery. So Lincoln wants to continue in this direction, and so does the bulk of his party. But now let's get back into politics. During World War II, Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Great Britain and never had to run for election. There was no election in Great Britain during World War II. They don't have a constitution that says you will have an election at this time. Lincoln faced re-election in 1864, and he said, what are we fighting for? We have to have an election. Now, we have a former U.S. Senator in Nevada named Richard Bryan. Fine man, fine politician, very successful at it. And Senator Bryan has a favorite phrase. He says there are two ways to run for office, unopposed or scared. Lincoln was scared. For one thing, the war's been going on since 1861. A lot of people are dying. A lot of people are injured. It's costing a lot of money. And people are tired of the war. Fair enough. In addition, there's precedent. Since 1832, no president had won a second term. Andrew Jackson won in 1832. He leaves after 2 terms. His successor lost his bid for re-election. After that, most of the presidents didn't even run for re-election. There's every reason for Abraham Lincoln to believe he could very easily be defeated. There's also the fact that his party was divided. There are a lot of Republicans to the left of him, the radicals, who feel he hasn't moved fast enough or strongly enough against slavery. And they have some disagreements with him on what will happen if the North wins. How do we bring the Southerns back into the Union? To the right of him, the conservative Republicans think he's done too much. And he's moved too fast. My analogy here, if I may use it, there was an old baseball umpire, and I love baseball. And he said that the act of umpiring a baseball game is the act of standing between 2 6-year-olds with 1 ice cream cone. In essence, that's what Lincoln's doing. He's using both sides. He will point to the radicals and say to the conservatives, hey, they're gonna make my life difficult if you don't give a little bit. And he's going over to the radicals saying, look, the conservatives, you got to do something with them or else. So he's a politician, and he's trying to move both sides in a similar direction. And if this sounds familiar, yeah, the Democratic Party today, the Senate caucus includes Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Joe Manchin of West Virginia. And they don't agree on everything. And Joe Biden and other Democrats have the ice cream cone. and are trying to figure out how to distribute it. Politics hasn't changed all that much. Well, Lincoln's getting ready to run for re-election, and he feels the only way to protect the policies he's pursued and to protect the Union is to have a constitutional amendment ending slavery. He wants it in his party's platform. Remember, the Union Party platform. More Democrats have to go along with this, and they do. They realize, as a lot of Americans did at the time, that without the institution of slavery, a civil war is very unlikely. And if the institution survives and the South comes back into the Union, they'll do it again. Now, to think about how the country had changed. In 1861, in an effort to get Southerners to come back, Congress had passed, and a Republican Congress did it, a constitutional amendment, a 13th Amendment at the time, as it was called, to end any attempt by the federal government to interfere with slavery. And now, after that amendment did not pass, they're going to try to have an amendment ending slavery. Now, some of you who are looking at this have seen the film about, well, actually, I claim it was a movie about Daniel Day-Lewis, and Abraham Lincoln portrayed Daniel Day-Lewis. I really think he was that good. In the movie, he is trying to get the amendment passed. The Senate easily passed the amendment, but the House had to pass it. And remember that it takes 2/3. And Lincoln knows he has to win re-election. And in keeping with this, two things happen, one of which is hard to believe today, and the other of which was a disaster. The thing that is hard to believe is that Lincoln wrote what became known as the Blind Memorandum in the summer of 1864. And he wrote this memo, turned it over, and had his cabinet sign it. And the memo said, I don't think I'm going to be reelected. And if I am not, and the Democrats win, they are not going to do anything to save the Union. And we have to take steps to do it. Now, I'm paraphrasing. But the idea that Lincoln would write that and think that speaks to the fact, yeah, he's not unopposed, he's scared. The other thing he does, he had a vice president, a Maine radical Republican named Hannibal Hamlin. And Hamlin didn't do anything for the ticket. It's sort of the idea of why does Biden choose Harris or Trump choose Pence or whatever. And Lincoln went along or was fine with or even was behind the nomination for vice president of a war Democrat who joined the Union Party, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, who at the time was saying he was anti-slavery. Well, Lincoln got reelected. The Union Party won on this platform that included amending the Constitution to eliminate slavery. And in the weeks before his second inauguration, Lincoln pushed the House to pass the amendment, and it did. And it went to the states, and the states ratified it. And the 13th Amendment to the Constitution took effect in December 1865, granting that by then the war was largely over. It was over. Technically, though, insurance companies didn't claim it was over yet. If you were a soldier and you got injured, you could still claim your insurance even later. Really. But in this case, enslavement in the United States under the 13th Amendment is in theory over. Well, Lincoln is inaugurated to a second term, and the issue now would be slavery is ending. The war is ending. What happens to the Southerners who rebelled? What happens to the enslaved people who will now be free? What would Lincoln have done? At one time, Lincoln had said he did not believe African Americans should serve on juries, have the right to vote, or anything like that. On April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. 2 nights later, responding to requests for a speech, Lincoln gave a speech. And it's a fascinating tableau, for lack of a better term. He's written it all out. He hated ad-libbing a major speech, and he knew this would be important coming 2 days after Lee's surrender. And he is standing there reading the speech, and each time he finishes a page, he drops it, and his son Tad is sitting out of the view of the crowd collecting the papers. And there's a little light being held up so Lincoln can read it. And he announces that with the war ending, with slavery ending, with the state of Louisiana having been voting on a constitution that ended slavery and was trying to determine what rights African Americans would have as freed people, he thought that it was time for African Americans to have the vote. Now, he said not all. His reference was to those who had served in the military and to the educated. There was a guy standing in the crowd that night named John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth heard him say those words, and I will not quote him exactly. But he said, "That means black citizenship. Now I'll kill him." And he did. And that is a reminder that the issue was incredibly controversial in ways to people at the time that today we don't, I think, take for granted, because we certainly should not take it for granted. But we pretty well figure these rights exist. They weren't so sure then. A historian who was my graduate advisor wrote a book called The Second Founding. Well, the 13th Amendment, passed before Lincoln died, and then after his death, the 14th and 15th Amendments, were designed to make sure that African Americans had citizenship rights and voting rights. But when Johnson became president, he did not believe strongly in those rights. He just believed slavery was bad, mainly, in his opinion, for white people as opposed to black people, and white people were who he was concerned about. And he did his best to limit what rights African Americans would have. When he left office, Ulysses Grant became president and deserves a lot of credit for his efforts to force Southerners and some Northerners to accept African Americans as equal citizens. But a lot of the country did not. And as an African American at the time said, the dark night of injustice settled over the land. The federal government quit trying to enforce African American rights, especially voting rights, to any substantial degree. Republicans still talked about it, and Democrats opposed it. And as time went on, those African Americans who could vote voted for the Republican Party. It was the party of Lincoln, and they did more than Democrats did. And then in 1932, in the midst of and at the worst of the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president. And in devising the New Deal, he gave a lot of power to the states. He did this because Southerners largely controlled Congress. And he said at one point to African American leaders, "I did not choose the tools I was given to work with." The New Deal did more for African Americans than any previous policy since Lincoln had, and it helped lead to the creation of the so-called New Deal coalition, where African Americans moved to the Democratic Party for the most part. They still were denied the vote in large parts of the South, for the most part, very few exceptions. But African Americans who could vote overwhelmingly voted Democratic. In 1948, the first Democratic convention after Franklin Roosevelt's death, Harry Truman was the president. And there was a group called Americans for Democratic Action. And they were acquainted with a politician, a mayor of Minneapolis named Hubert Horatio Humphrey. And Humphrey got up at the 1948 convention with Truman already having ordered the desegregation of the armed forces, with, by the way, generals like Douglas MacArthur fighting him every step of the way. And Humphrey made a speech saying it is time for the Democratic Party to walk out of the shadow of states' rights and into the bright light of civil rights. And Strom Thurmond and other Southern Democrats walked out of the convention, formed the Dixiecrats. Truman managed to win. There were a lot of splits that year. But almost immediately, the Republican Party began an effort to recruit the Dixiecrats. And in 1964, they nominated Barry Goldwater, a senator from Arizona, who was an exponent of states' rights. He voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, arguing that it should be left to the states. And the only states Goldwater carried beyond his state were in the Deep South. And it is said that Lyndon Johnson turned to an aide when the Civil Rights Act passed, and he said, "I've just cost us the South for 2 generations." Well, Goldwater and the other advocates against the Civil Rights Act were, you might say, a little too obvious. And in 1968, Richard Nixon came up with what they called the Southern Strategy. And the Southern Strategy was not to state directly that they opposed civil rights, but to talk about things like law and order, not the TV series, but the idea that African Americans had been demonstrating. There'd been protests, some of them violent, some of them costly. And if you were calling for law and order, you were calling for African Americans to be kept from doing that. And the Republican Party, since then, has really struggled at times with this approach. And in recent years, seems to have taken the approach that, well, we're not getting the votes of African Americans for the most part, and we're not going to seek them. At the same time, they do make efforts, no question about it. But if you really want to get a historian going, you say that, well, the Democratic Party is the party of the KKK and the Republicans are the party of Lincoln. And this leaves out the switches that occurred over civil rights. It leaves out, by the way, other changes on other issues. Democrats were involved in forming the KKK in the 1860s. Republicans were the party of Lincoln in the 1850s and 60s. Things have changed dramatically. Now, there is the comment that coded language is still used today, and that is absolutely the case. And throughout history, people have used language to make certain points, to, shall we say, obfuscate or hide certain points. There's a story of Dwight Eisenhower, who supposedly had trouble saying a simple sentence, where he said to his press secretary before going out to explain a policy, "Don't worry, I'll confuse them." Well, sometimes you can be subtle about it, and sometimes you're not so subtle. But there's a lot of coded language in use today. In Lincoln's time, less coded language, perhaps, and unfortunately more blatant, what we would call today, racism and racial discrimination. Lincoln was moving in the right direction, as I hope I've conveyed. He was moving toward the more radical Republican side, as opposed to the conservative Republican side at the time. He also was very much aware of public opinion. He both sought to shape it and understood his need not to get too far out ahead of it. If he took too radical a position, he could lose support he needed from conservatives. If he took too conservative position, the opposite. So he's a politician trying to do his best, and at times doing good. And certainly, as he went along, doing better. Well, that's what I've lectured on, so to speak. And I'm seeing some comments pop up. And one of them, so both parties have roots in racism at some point in their creation story. Absolutely. And it's interesting that, for example, there were Republicans who we call radical, very anti-slavery, who were outright bigots. They did not like African Americans. They just felt it was wrong to enslave them. And they're here and they should be treated as regular citizens, but it didn't mean they liked them. And Frederick Douglass provides us with an interesting example from Lincoln, who seemed less radical, of course. And he said that Lincoln always talked to me like he would talk to any other person, and there was no sense that my color was different from his. There's a cute little story about Douglass that I think is worth sharing. I think Lincoln's greatest speech was not Gettysburg, but his second inaugural address. And that is the speech that concludes with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. And he's making this plea for unity. He also said in that speech that this war is our penalty for slavery. And he says, if God wills that it continue, to make up for the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil, until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be replaced by another drawn with the sword, then shall it be said that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. It's an incredible speech. Well, I'll come to the question about Douglass in a minute, and I do think that this story may address the question of whether today's Republican Party mirrors that of Douglass's. The night of Lincoln's second inauguration, there was a party at the White House, and John Wilkes Booth is going to affect a few things, and one of them is you don't throw the White House doors open. Well, they threw them open, and people are coming in there, and Lincoln shaking hands and so on, and Douglass decided to go. And Washington, D.C. was, and in many ways still is, a southern city. And he got to the door, and they wouldn't let him in. The idea of an African American entering the White House, no. And Lincoln saw Douglass at the door and said, "There is my friend Douglass." And I love this because Lincoln, you remember, was very tall. He stepped over a couch to go up to see Douglass. And he said, "Douglass, I value your opinion more than any other man's. What did you think of my speech?" Well, having been asked that way, Douglass was going to say it was a great speech, but he did feel it was a great speech. Douglass felt the Republican Party of Lincoln's time was, politically speaking, a far better bet than the Democratic Party. There were abolitionists who would not associate with any party. Douglass believed you have to work in the system, and he supported the Republican Party. Today, I think I am safe in saying this. Frederick Douglass would be a Democrat. And it's not because Democrats are perfect, but the party of Donald Trump, the party of Ron DeSantis, is not the Republican Party that Frederick Douglass knew. They have changed, just as Democrats have changed. And I'm not going to say that Democrats are perfect or Republicans are completely evil. But when we're talking about those changes in those policies, it's a different world. If you have questions, pop them in there. I will look through the correct half of the bifocals. That happens in class. A student will raise their hand and I'll be going along and say, "Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking through the bottom part and didn't see." So,
Well, thank you, Dr. Green, for that.
Thank you.
That was great. And I'll read off this question, and then I have several here as well.
Sure.
The question is, should African Americans continue to believe that working within an organized party is a benefit?
I believe so. And I believe so because we have a two-party system. Now, we do not have to have a two-party system. And if I wanted to go back farther, and I could, I'm a history professor. We love to talk. The founding fathers opposed political parties. And one of the reasons that the whole business was so vicious between Thomas Jefferson and Lin-Manuel Miranda, Alexander Hamilton, was they didn't believe political parties should exist. So if you're opposing me, you're a traitor. But we end up with a two-party system. My response would be, if you want to work for a third party or a new party, do not even think of running a presidential candidate. Republicans got lucky in 1856 and 1860. You have to organize from the bottom up. And actually, Republicans were doing that. They benefited from the fact that the party system was in a state of flux. And we're not now in that state of flux. In a second, I'll talk about how we could be. But even then, Lincoln talked about this, that after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we were working together, even if we disagreed on a lot of things, if we were Democrats or Whigs, whatever, and we're working together, and this guy would grab an axe, and this guy would grab an axe, and we'd go at the tree together, not worrying about where the axes came from, or something like that. Now, we could end up in that kind of state of flux if the Republican Party is divided. The Democratic Party often is divided, but actually the Democratic Party, and I'm not saying this is a partisan, this is pure fact, the Democratic Party has been incredibly united in the last few years, and the first 2 years of the Biden administration. And now you have, among Republicans, Donald Trump, who, in my opinion, won over a lot of Republicans by saying aloud what they believed, but other politicians would not say. And the question is what will happen for the 2024 election with the Republican Party. There could be another party system. It could happen. I'm not saying it will. But if that happens, then maybe. In the meantime, we have two parties, and I'm a great believer in being a termite. Infest, chew it up, tear down the house, and go to it.
One of the challenging things in as you were presenting is just the question for me, and I'd love your thoughts on this, of where you think we draw the line between Lincoln's political game, because he really was a strong political strategist and spoke very much in that terms of that strategy. So where do we draw the line between that political side and his personal perspectives? Like, how can we know what his personal perspectives were when so much of it was feeding into the political side of things?
It's difficult in part because there's so much we do not know. I am looking over at my bookcase, and there is the 9-volume set of the collected works of Abraham Lincoln. Now, there's more stuff now. They found some legal papers. They found some other stuff. The Jefferson papers are 50 volumes and still going. However much Lincoln wrote, there's a lot that disappeared that we haven't figured out yet. So it can be hard to draw a line when we aren't too sure where the lines might actually be. It's a difficult argument. It's a difficult situation. And we run into this, I mean, you can cite far less political examples. What is the line between the art and the artist? And I think we all have to draw our own lines. I think that Lincoln did not believe that African Americans should be second-class citizens. I think he said some things that made it sound more that way. I think he was kind of throwing up his hands at how other people felt. And he, in his papers, he would write notes. He would doodle, for lack of a better term. And it would be thoughts he wanted to try to get to, or that he thought might help him with a speech. And there's one that goes something like this. He says, A claims he has the right to enslave B because B's skin is darker than his. Ah! But what if someone comes along whose skin is lighter than A's? Does that mean that person gets to enslave A? And he is thinking about these issues. He is a work in progress, I think, in a good way. I'm not going to minimize that he said some awful things. I'm not going to minimize that if he showed up today, if he popped up as a third window in this discussion, that the things he had said wouldn't be somewhere between cringy and reprehensible. But I do think for his time, he was very advanced on a personal level and tried very hard not to let his personal views get ahead of his political views. By the way, I can see this. Kimberly Robinson has said this, and I agree in a lot of ways, and I'll argue in a way. The two-party system continues to be our downfall. It's like watching a perpetual tennis match with no winner. Yeah, it's a problem. And just to tell you that things don't change too much, the biggest problem, well, there are a couple of them, but one of the biggest problems we have today is gerrymandering. So that if you are in a very liberal district or a very conservative district, you have no reason to move, to compromise. Now, there was a congressman from Massachusetts, Barney Frank, who said once as he was retiring, I've gotten thousands of letters, calls, emails telling me to go to hell. I've gotten just as many telling me I'm wonderful and what I'm proposing is wonderful. And I can count on two hands the number I've gotten saying, you really need to compromise with the other side. We should not really expect politicians to do better than we ourselves do. But in 1858, Abraham Lincoln was a more popular candidate than Stephen Douglas for the Senate in Illinois. He got more votes. His legislators got more votes. But because of gerrymandering, Douglas was reelected. So it's an age-old problem. And I don't question it, but I'll go back to something Churchill supposedly said, that democracy is the worst form of government except the others. I'd like there to be a better system. I wish I could figure out how it worked. All right, go ahead.
In addition to Ms. Robinson's comment there, which I think we're all kind of on the same page there, there was also a comment earlier that history repeats itself in American politics. And the question that raises for me now, and you spoke to it a little bit earlier already, is do you think we are starting to see another shift? Like we saw with the shift from the Whigs to Lincoln as part of the Republican Party, are we starting to see another shift in the kind of fractioning that we're seeing within the Republican Party that could lead to either a stronger third or a shifted second party system?
I hope so. I'm not convinced. And I'll sort of wander about in talking about this. When Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, any of you who have watched a presidential bill signing may have noticed there are pens galore and bill copies galore. And he signs it and he hands a pen, signs it, hands a pen. And these are souvenirs and they matter to people. When Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, first one, he turned and he handed the first pen to Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois, who was the Senate Minority Leader, a Republican, because Dirksen watered down the bill, sad to say, but he also got some Republican votes to counteract the Southern Democrats who wouldn't vote for it. We used to have conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, and I hate how those terms are used now. When we say, oh, he's a conservative. Well, Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, name the leading Republican right now. They're not conservative. And I don't say that critically. I don't have to agree with them. But if you're conservative, you're trying to maintain the status quo. They're not trying to maintain the status quo. I think Democrats are closer to being conservative than Republicans if we define our terms correctly. But I also think that Democrats are certainly a lot more liberal. The problem we have is that the division among Republicans at the moment doesn't tend to be based nearly so much on policy as it is on personalities. And so let us suppose, for the sake of argument, Donald Trump suddenly gets on Elon Musk's rocket to Mars or whatever. Will another Republican pop up, say the same things Trump did, and be as popular with the party? Now, at the same time, there are a lot of people who would not vote for Trump. Democrats have benefited strongly from this because you have, I think, suburban residents, women who have said, no, this is a bridge too far. But another way to think about it, Liz Cheney voted with Donald Trump 93% of the time. Think about it. 93 wasn't good enough because on the one big thing that mattered to him, and unfortunately to too many other Republicans, she broke with him. And it cost her her congressional seat, which she was willing to give up. Now, when we talk about that, okay, so if Liz Cheney were to run for president and she splits off the Republican Party, does that mean we might end up with traditionally right-wing, or call them conservative Republicans, who have certain positions on abortion and taxes and enforcing civil rights that you and I may find unacceptable? We could never vote for them. But at the same time, they are not of the same stripe as a Donald Trump or the people who surround him. Is that enough? I don't know. I have often been asked, well, what does the future hold? And I say historians have trouble predicting the past. There was someone who was writing a novel once and said, my characters keep doing things I didn't expect. There's a lot of truth to that, even when we look at history, because when we're looking back, we think, rethink, find new evidence. There's a line that it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think we're seeing too much rhyming at times. But I noticed this question. So are human and civil rights conservative traits? I think if we have natural rights that Jefferson talked about, remembering what Jefferson also did, but aren't they rights that are supposedly in the Constitution? If they are, do we need to change the Constitution? Well, if we all agree on them, then they really should be conservative. I think you can make that argument. But instead, we end up having to make the argument, and this goes to the question about the party split. We end up making the argument that this is liberal. Well, the Constitution says the right to vote shall not be denied on account of race. Okay? Fair enough. What happens when you pass a bill that limits where polling places are and make sure, as was the case in certain states, that there are fewer polling places in predominantly African American areas? Isn't that a violation of the 15th Amendment? Well, no, you can still vote. That's what the defenders would say. You can still vote. So maybe it's partly that, to give you all a little confession, 6 years ago, I just had the anniversary, I was put on the professor watch list for things I said in public about Donald Trump. Never said them in class and never would. But I have the right to say them, I thought, and instead I ended up getting death threats. Well, I want to claim to be a conservative. I want to conserve this country and its rights. Maybe that makes me a preservationist.
One of the things that is so hard to reconcile in a lot of this conversation is what really the place of Black peoples were in all of these narratives.
Mm.
Because in some of it, it is the perception of, or the question of whether or not they were people or full people, or should have equal or full rights, or to what level uh, that should exist. And behind that narrative often seems to be some of the political maneuvering, or the financial or industrial movements that um, it, essentially the enslaved peoples, or even after slavery, and then just Black freed peoples became sort of pawns, if you will, in these different political moves. So, how do you see that kind of playing out um, in in the time of Lincoln and as we move into the present?
And I referred to the self-emancipation thesis. There is a tendency, unfortunately, or there was, I think in my profession it has changed, and it's changed for the better, to discount Black agency. The idea that African Americans were just having it happen to them and weren't doing anything. And the fact is, there's a lot of organizing, there are a lot of things going on. There's also segregation. And in this segregation, within where they are, where African Americans can take action, they do. Politically speaking, sad to say, might didn't make right, but might mattered. And we do not and should not excuse the North. We should not ignore that there are other groups being disenfranchised, discriminated against, who are also organizing. Whether it is forming, where African Americans are forming unions because the AFL-CIO did not want African American members because they felt that African Americans would work for less money. And so African Americans are forming their own organizations and political groups, and eventually the NAACP and groups connected to the NAACP. So we are seeing more information come out, more study of this history. We still have a long ways to go in terms of finding out more about what happened and who made it happen. And an example of this, one of the shortcuts or shorthand ways to talk about debates within the African American community and about the role of African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is to pair up Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, the accommodationist Washington and the activist Du Bois. Booker T. Washington was a lot more active than a lot of people realized. But he also thought, I cannot go to this point or we are going to have too much trouble. And trouble in this case meant being killed. We often tend not to think that's the outcome in politics, but that can be. And it is not to minimize Du Bois in the least, one of my idols. But it's often too easy to take one position or the other and to say one thing or the other. And I wanted to mention something here in response to, not really in response, but to comment on what Ms. Robinson said about this is the history that has been lost. When Blacks create our own organizations, we are accused of being self-segregating. Yeah, that's the accusation. We know better. This was something that could not be avoided. And there's a vast amount of historical context that is being dismissed. A couple of things related to this, I think. And I'm going to use some local history I've been involved in as an example. I was doing a history of the newspapers in Las Vegas in the 1950s, and I'm going through the microfilm, and I am seeing these missing issues of this new newspaper. And I knew a guy who worked there. And I said to him, you've got full issues missing, or you've got pieces cut out. And he said, look, we were just starting out trying to survive. We didn't worry about that stuff. We didn't think about whether it'd be on microfilm for you to look at. Well, yeah, you're trying to survive. It doesn't mean you sit there saying, I must make sure I preserve this for future generations. So we often are dependent on what people have saved and how we read the story and how we read the evidence. To give an example of this, in the writing of the history of enslavement, one of the first major books on the history of slavery was by a guy named Ulrich B. Phillips, who looked at the sources that he thought he should look at. And those sources were whites' works, diaries, letters, speeches, account books. And he concluded, oh, it was a wonderful institution and people were happy to be in it because that's what they wrote. And later, another historian did a book where he literally took Phillips' sources and went back and reread them. And from the perspective of someone, and he was white, but an advocate of civil rights, and came up with the opposite conclusions. And that is why there's an old line, our only obligation to history is to rewrite it. We have to keep examining and re-examining it. The other thing locally, to go to Ms. Robinson's point, we had in the late 50s and early 60s a magnificent group of civil rights leaders here in Las Vegas. And one of them, when he did his oral history years later, said, I'm afraid we were too successful. We have in Las Vegas an area called the West Side or West Las Vegas, where African Americans were segregated. And when they were able to end that segregation, at least legal segregation, you could move where you wanted to move if you could afford to move there. And he said, capital left the area. And West Las Vegas is still having financial issues. It is an economically poorer area of Las Vegas, not because we should look at one group of people or another a certain way, but people with capital could go elsewhere. And so there was no longer the same kind of segregation. There might be economic segregation, but it was not legal to discriminate racially. Obviously, we know it continues. And I'm interested to know more about changing it from the Black artisan market to the multicultural market, because West Las Vegas was almost entirely African American. There were other groups in there, but now it has become increasingly Hispanic with the growth of the Latino population and Latina population in Las Vegas. The newest arrivals who may have the least money are going to move into areas they can afford to live. That's the reality.
Yeah, what's really challenging in this is, I think, the question of who gets to define these terms. Even as we're talking about liberal or conservative, going back to the Federalist versus anti-Federalist, Republican versus Democrat, and even to the modern day as we're getting into this conversation, the story behind the name change is that the Live Black Experience, one of our projects, was the Black Artisan Marketplace, which was intended to feature the Black store owners and entrepreneurs and folks within the Flagstaff community and surrounding area, while also being open to all and any who wanted to participate. And the response that was received by the group was that it was racist to call it a Black artisan market. And even in looking at the comparative other markets that are allowed to take place in and around our area, it was specifically because it was called Black that it was considered problematic. And to firm up and to support that effort, we shifted the name to the multicultural market to bypass those critiques and anyone who would stand in the way of that being successful, despite realizing that it was not a change that should have been necessary. And so it's still, I think we see even now, um, the question of who gets to define what
Yes.
we even are allowed to call this. Even as you were speaking about the New Deal, I was thinking about that as well. And one of the articles that was shared out was just talking about the opportunities that the New Deal created.
Mm-hmm.
However, it ultimately being because of Black organizers and organizations that were insistent upon those things being accessible to them, that it began to create changes within the Black community. So it's
Mm-hmm.
just a continuing cycle of figuring out, where do we fall in this narrative? Is this actually something that is considering us, or are we just kind of playing pieces on this board that is not really a game that was meant for us?
Well, and it's not necessarily a game. And I think the narrative changes. I think the board changes. And I wish that what should be was and is. And maybe we can get there. I hope so.
In speaking of Lincoln, and I know we are approaching time, but um, I guess the question of his view of parties,
Mhm.
and you mentioned that he was opposed to the idea of fighting against the system, or voting a third party because it was just essentially throwing that away. But would you say that he actually was in favor of those party systems, or was he simply, is it a matter of he played in the sandbox because he wanted the sand, not the box?
I think it may be closer to wanting the sand,
Yeah.
not the box. How am I going to win? How am I? And this goes to a line a politician I knew had, where he said, politics and policy are inseparable. That you can't make policy unless you've won the election. And you can't win unless you've got good policies. So I think it is important to think that way about politics. And I think Lincoln thought that way. We can talk all we want about wanting to change things, but if we cannot get in positions to make changes, then what do we do?
Mhm.
We end up dissenting, and dissenting wisely and well, perhaps, but have we accomplished much? And I'm afraid we don't end up getting what we really would like. And I see a question here: do people care about good policies or a good show? And I think part of the answer to that is, if they care more about a good show, give them the show with the policies. Or to put it another way, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Sorry, I like musicals. And I mean, I say this as someone who has to teach. I don't have to, I guess, but I do for a living. But I have to teach students who don't want to be there at times. You have to teach surveys where they're getting a requirement out of the way or whatever. And part of what I seek to do is present the material in a way that interests them. And whether it is Katie Porter with a whiteboard, I get a kick out of that, using the whiteboard, partly because I prefer chalk, but I have to use a whiteboard now myself, to whatever performative sorts of things you might have to do to get the point across. There are times you can't do it in a 30-second campaign commercial. And there are times 30 seconds may actually be too long. We don't have to stop to think about that either. But I think that if you can find a way to communicate what you are seeking in a way that appeals to the audience, you have a chance. And maybe you don't need the party system for that. We may recall a guy on the evening news named Walter Cronkite. Cronkite was interviewing Ted Kennedy, who had said, I don't want to run for vice president or whatever it was. And Cronkite said, well, don't you think maybe you need to do that to be able to make a difference? And Kennedy said, you do not have necessarily to hold the presidency or vice presidency to make a difference, Mr. Cronkite. You make a difference, Mr. Cronkite. Well, maybe we can make a difference. Here's to fighting for the difference.
I want to close out with and circle back to this last comment from Ms. Robinson, where she says the response to the multicultural market is another example of lift yourself up by your bootstraps, but only in a way that is palatable to the majority. And I think that has been kind of at the heart of, or at least near the center of a lot of the conversation that we've been having tonight. And I think it's a message that I would love for our audience to take from tonight's conversation is we are all in different ways playing the game, but we are not necessarily all playing on the same board. And there are certainly challenges to figuring out how to navigate a board, particularly when you are part of a community that the board was never designed for or to be accommodating to.
Or they turn over the board to shake up the pieces.
Right, exactly. And so I think for our community, part of what we hope that folks take from this conversation is that the narrative is never as simple as it may seem from the outside. It takes evaluation and reevaluation and constant assessment. And that is the work that we are doing as part of this Live Black Experience Dialogue project is continuing to stir up that narrative and shake things up so that we can take new and fresh looks at some of the history as well as our present and taking us into the future. I will read off this statement of just thank you, Dr. Green. I'm not going to include myself in.
I'll include you. It says Councilwoman House.
So thank you very much for your presentation tonight and for the conversation that you engaged in with us and with the audience as well.
Thank you. I was honored to be asked to be part of it.
Thanks. And thank you to our audience as well. As always, it is a pleasure to come and speak with you and to have the opportunity to engage with you. I want to this evening give a special shout out to our LBE coordinator, who herself was a part of an unfortunate narrative in our community that reminds us that this narrative is one that we need to continue bringing light to. These are conversations that we need to continue having. And I believe that we as a community in these dialogues stand with our coordinator, Ms. Robinson, and others who are willing to step out there and have these conversations despite the negativity and nastiness and frankly just horrific responses that are sometimes given in terms of what we're doing. So we thank you to our audience who chooses to tune in and join us in that spirit of community and unity and togetherness and moving forward in positive ways. We look forward to seeing you next time, which will be tomorrow evening. And until then, as always, we hope that you go in grace.